So we're going to be talking on access control systems and their strengths and weaknesses. I'm Eric Schmiedel. This is Mike Spindell. We're a couple of MIT students. Mike, take it away.
All right. Okay, so before talking about access control technologies, in particular, I'm going to talk about access control in general and some of the different factors that go into deciding what kind of system is suitable. When understanding, evaluating a particular access control solution, you need to look at a number of different things. You need to look at the error rate. You need to look at what environment you expect to use it in. You need to understand how much it's going to cost and how much you can afford to spend on it. You need to see how it's going to fit into the rest of your physical security and what kinds of vulnerabilities it can introduce. And certainly you need to look at any additional constraints introduced by the particular facility or situation. The error rate in an access control system is simply how often it makes a mistake. And in physical access control, it's divided into two types. You have false rejections and you have false accepts. The false rejection rate is frequently referred to also as the insult rate, simply because you're in some sense insulting a user by saying that they're not valid. Now, there's a clear trade-off between the two. And in order to understand how secure a given system is or how accurate a system is, you need a different metric. And that's where the equal error rate comes in. The equal error rate is simply the error rate for is simply the error rate when a system is configured such that the false accept rate equals the false rejection rate. Now, looking at the environment that a system is going to be working in, you need to understand whether or not it's going to have to deal with severe cold or severe heat. You need to understand whether it's going to be inside or outside, or whether it's going to be subject to severe vandalism. For example, your great new $2,000 fingerprint scanner is not going to work very well if it's covered in spray paint. Cost almost goes without saying. Systems can get ridiculously expensive. The price increases almost exponentially with features, whether or not they're needed or not. The way it works with the rest of your system, this is interesting because presumably you buy access control to project security, right? But a lot of times, it can have unintended consequences. For example, a number of electric strikes simply can disable the anti-carding features in typical lock sets. And the way that works is sort of straightforward. Most lock sets have a feature to prevent you from pushing the latch in from outside. This is called anti-loiding, or anti-celluloid, from the celluloid that you originally used to do this. But a lot of electric strikes have a hole in the door that's so large, the anti-loiding latch just sort of falls inside and it stops working. Electromagnets too. Electromagnetism falls off as distance squared. And so if you're expecting it to work after somebody's taped a piece of cardboard in front of your electromagnet, you might be in for an unfortunate surprise. And of course, motion detectors are also a lot of fun. You have a motion detector on one side of your maglock door to comply with fire code. But it's almost a self-defeating problem, though. Somebody can just stick a tape measure through the hole if you have a double door. They can stick a balloon under the door and trip the motion detector from the other side, and bang, it's open. So it's always important to understand how this kind of system fits in with the rest of your physical security. And of course, every situation is different. A solution that works for an office of 5 might not be able to handle the peak load of a huge facility. Different places need different amounts of control over who's where and when they are. You need to understand how integrated the security system has to be with everything else. And certainly, you need to understand whether or not you need an audit control. Of course, if you have one physical security system, if you have one piece of access control, if you have a keypad, if you have a keypad, that's great. If you have a lock, that's great. But if you have two, twice as good, right? Well, maybe not. The problem is that in the typical configuration where you have just two things, right? You have just say a keypad or you have a keypad and a biometric. If these things only give a binary answer, a yes or a no, then you're stuck in a situation where you can only improve either the false accept or improve the false reject. This is because there are two simple cases, right? Either both systems say go, both systems say don't go, and that makes sense. But in the other case where you have one system say go, the other one says don't go, then either you let the person through, right, and you increase your false accept rate, or you don't let them through and you increase your false rejection rate. Of course, once you have more than two, say you have three factors, or those factors start giving more detailed information like a score, a matching score and a biometric, then you can do all sorts of great things using your favorite classifiers from machine learning. You can use Bayesian classifying and things like that to find the optimal mix. Now, when you're building a multi-factor system, the classic three things you want to have is the what you have, the what you know, and the what you are. Just because they're three sort of divergent things that an imposter would have to take different approaches to stealing. But while you're constructing one of these things, it's important to understand how the different factors can interact with each other. For example, a typical situation has a mechanical key override for some kind of electronic system. But if you can simply bump your mechanical key or you use or pick it or anything like that, then you've sort of rendered your $1,000 security system sort of pointless. Centralized systems. Some systems are centralized. In all of these things, they basically produce a bunch of bits, and you're shoving them around a network. And we sort of all know the problems inherent in that. So not much more needs to be said. Now Eric's going to talk a bit about different categories of access control.
Well, there's really four. You have guard-based, which is the simplest and the oldest, token-based, which we all use, knowledge-based, which is used on a lot of alarm systems, for example, and biometrics, which is used a lot in spy movies. Guard is the simplest and the oldest. It's really evolved from having a big beefy guy there with a club, to a big beefy guy there with a gun, to a big beefy guy there with a gun, a badge, and a radio checking photo IDs. It has a very low initial startup cost. It doesn't cost an awful lot to hire a guy for $9 an hour to sit there and look at photos. It's fast. It doesn't take very long to compare a photograph to a person in front of you. And it isn't very much affected by the environment, because if it gets cold, the guy can put on a heavy winter coat, and he probably won't get vandalized unless he falls asleep, in which case you should fire him anyway. Now, unfortunately, it's pretty easy to counterfeit ID cards. For the last couple of decades, teenagers have been shelling out a lot of money to get fake IDs to get themselves into bars before they're legally allowed to. And if you think that your brand new shiny photo ID with super advanced anti-copying features is going to be better at preventing copies than the driver's license that the local DMV has spent the last couple of decades refining, then you're probably kidding yourself, or you're with the INS. The other thing is, cards can get stolen. Dead easy. Guy gets pickpocketed, the bad guy cuts up the photo, puts in his own photo, just like in a James Bond movie, flashes it by the guard, no big deal. People can get complacent. Guards can stop checking photographs entirely. And of course, guards have salaries. This means that over 10 or 20 years, that $9 an hour can add up to a lot more than $5,000 for a brand new high-tech system would have cost you originally. Lastly, there's a story going around. A couple years ago, a base commander at some military installation in the gigantic U.S. military-industrial complex decided to check the security of his installation. So he called up 2 security contractors that were working for him. These were guys he'd known from college, guys he'd been drinking with, guys he knew he could trust. And he tells them to go down to the security office and pick up some new badges and tells them what the game is. They get their new badges, which are entirely legit, except for the photographs have been replaced with photographs of baboons. He wants to see how long it'll take the guy at the front desk to pick up on this alteration of the photographs. He figures it'll take him maybe a day or 2, at the most. Maybe a week. If it's a month, it's really scary, but it's not going to happen. It takes a couple of months, and it's only found when the guard who has some butterfingers that day fumbles and drops the card on the ground, reaches down to pick it up, and only then finally looks at the photograph and is like, whoa, something's wrong here. Now, I have no idea whether or not this story is true. I do know, however, that at the University of Westminster they did a study with a couple of students. 44 students went through supermarket checkout lines carrying the then newfangled credit cards with photo ID. And they told the supermarket checkers to either accept the ID or deny it based on the signature or deny it based on the photograph. The supermarket checkers therefore knew what was up. They knew they were doing a study. This was after hours. There were no other customers in the store. Overall, they failed just about 33% of the time. They weren't being completely careless. They weren't saying, it's a study, I'm here for the money, okay. Because half of them at least rejected a perfectly legitimate ID at least once. They were pretty paranoid guys. Unfortunately, that paranoia didn't help them because 34% of the time they accepted a completely wrong photograph. This was a photograph that the experimenters had selected of a person of the same race, of the same sex, but otherwise judged to be completely different from the student who is supposed to be carrying the ID. Overall, 50% of the time, they accepted a fake ID. 64% of the time, they accepted the ID if it had a similar-looking photograph. Let's face it, this isn't a terribly secure system. Next, I'm going to talk about tokens, or at least Mike is going to talk about tokens.
Tokens. Tokens are what you have in the security triumvirate, if you will. They're great. You can keep them in your pocket, put them on your keychain. They can get lost. You can get stolen. They can be copied. They're great. Probably the oldest one that's still in common use today is the mechanical key. It's invented by the Egyptians 2,000 years ago. They're a lot of fun. They're very reliable in the general case. They don't even need power. If there's a power outage, you don't have to worry about fail secure versus fail safe. It's they keep working. They're a lot of fun. But on the other hand, they don't really have an audit trail. Certainly, there are some special lock sets that have an electronic sensor in the back that can tell whether the lock is open or closed and keep track of that. But, most of the time, there's no audit trail there. They've got a lot of specific security issues. You can buy lockpicks on the internet and go pick them open. You can buy bump keys on eBay and bump them open. You can walk down to your neighborhood locksmith, buy a key blank for 30 cents and make a bump key with a file and bump them open. You can decode them with a thin piece of wire and measure the height with the pin stacks and understand, and then go down to your locksmith, buy a key blank, and then file an actual key and open them the right way. There are a lot of different special, targeted things that you can do to attack mechanical locks. They've been discussed really well elsewhere, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on them. But I would like to talk a little bit about how these keys work when you have a big system of them. Because, the interesting thing about, mechanical locks is that every single lock not only has all the information necessary to open that lock inside of it, every lock also has a little bit of information about every other lock in the system, like everything else that's going on around it. And, that can have a surprising effect. Certainly, Matt Blaze published a paper, a couple years ago. It was caused quite a commotion. The locksmiths figured it out. They published it in a magazine in 1958. It managed to say secret, unpublished since then. But the problem is that a huge number of master key systems, one of the cardinal rules is that the top master key cannot share any pins with the change key. This is a particular style of master keying, but that's one of the cardinal rules of it. And so the thing is, if you have a change key and you have a lock, and you want to test every single pin, and check, okay, which other pin or which other key cut besides the one on this change key opens this lock. And you do that for every single pin, and by the time you've done it, you figured out where all the other second cuts are in your master lock, and you've got the top master key. Beyond this, you can also just take the locks apart if you can pick them, and then you can just read the pin stacks inside of that, and you either have, at that point, the master key, or you have a master key that opens more doors than it should, but maybe not all of the doors. And you can accumulate multiple cylinders and more cylinders and figure out eventually what the actual master key is. And then again, you also have the colluding secretaries problem, right? Because, it's certainly not locksmithing best practice, but nearby doors often have nearby keys. And so if you have a secretary who's got a keychain for a set of offices, so she can handle mail and things like that, then those keys or that set of keys is going to give you a remarkable amount of information about the actual system. And if you have several secretaries from, say, different parts of the building all talking to each other about what's on their keyring, then all of a sudden you have a severely large amount of information about the way the system is structured that's been lost. And it can take remarkably few of these keys to actually get very, very close to the entire layout of the system. So it's important to understand how these things work together. Now, there are many different mechanical locks. Primus, Medico, lots of different things. They all have different approaches to mitigating some of these problems, but in general, they all have a variety of these issues. Continuing the mechanical thing, the Ving card is a mechanical punched key card. They were very popular in hotels at one point because they're very easy to rekey. Unfortunately, as you can see, they're also very easy to copy. You just look at them. In fact, there was a hotel. They had a problem with a ring of thieves. The thieves would go around. They would take photos of the maid's keys, and then they would just go get a X-Acto knife, cut their own keys, and go to town on the hotel. This is a real problem. Even more so, they still have the same problem as other mechanical locks, in that the lock has all the information that you need to make a key. And more than that, with these cards, because the pin tumblers inside that sort of that are actuated by the holes in the non-holes, those apply pressure that can be read by a detector. You simply have a detector card. You insert it into the key, into the lock, and you can read it. So obviously they're low security, which is why you don't really see them so much anymore. And yet they still exist in large legacy installations. In addition to electronics and mechanics, magnetism has been a boon for access control designers. Perhaps the most common is the magnetic stripe card. In lieu of a photo, I just refer all of you to your own wallets, since they are prolific. Before talking about magnetism and access control, I need to say a word about coercivity. Coercivity is just a measure of magnetic field strength. And when you're talking about magnetic piece of access control, it generally refers to how strong magnetic field you need to write to the magnet to change the thing. Now, magnetic stripe cards come in two varieties, with a third sort of pending. There's a low coercivity cards. They've been in use since the 60s. They were standardized in the 80s. They're made out of iron oxide. And there's high coercivity cards made out of barium ferrite. They've been used for quite a while, but they weren't really standardized until 2001. These things are reliable as long as there's not another magnet around. The problem with low coercivity cards is that even a high coercivity mag stripe card can corrupt the information on a low coercivity mag stripe card. So they can cause all sorts of problems there. The audit trail, though, is nice because it's electronic, so it's only limited by the back end. So you have lots of flexibility there, and they're cheap, so they're nice to have that. Unfortunately, they're trivial to read, duplicate, and sometimes modify if you don't have a Mac or some other kind of confirmation on there. High coercivity cards are perhaps a little bit more difficult to write, but still, just slightly more expensive. Some people try and hide information on the cards, right? They'll try and use a non-standard location on the track. They'll try and use non-standard start or end sentinels. This is a big fan of. This is used a lot in some of the sort of automated transit solutions. But really, you can pull a magnetic reader out of a $2 tape cassette player, plug that into your sound card, and sort of wave it around on the mag stripe card, and you can read whatever they have on there. Now, there is one solution for dealing with duplicated cards. So remember, we're talking about the low coercivity and high coercivity solutions, right? These are mixtures of iron oxide or barium ferrite, and there's this sort of analog bit of that to it. And you can make a fingerprint from the grains of iron oxide that are on the magnetic stripe card, and you can make a profile for this. And the thing is that almost every card has a fairly unique sort of fingerprint of where these grains and bits of iron oxide are. There's a company called Magtech. They make a product called Magneprint, which validates cards based on this. It was, I think, used briefly by MasterCard International. I'm not sure if it was ever fully deployed, though. Prior to high coercivity mag stripe cards, you had a lot of very sort of ad hoc solutions. Every company was sort of making their own thing, and collectively these are referred to as barium ferrite cards. They preceded the HICO standard, and they typically worked by embedding a layer of barium ferrite in between some layers of plastic, or something like that. They were nice because they were very reliable, and they were high coercivity, and they were resistant to weather because they were just sort of a piece of plastic. But they were all very low resolution. They didn't have very much information on them, and so they were easy to decode. You could simply shake some iron filings on them, and you'd find the magnetized areas. They aren't really used anymore. Sometimes you'll see them in automated parking systems. That's about it. Probably my favorite, at least I think the most interesting of the magnetic access control systems is based on this stuff called Wiegand wire. Before talking about the actual Wiegand wire cards, I need to say a bit about ferromagnetism and about Wiegand wire itself. So this is great. So in a ferromagnetic material, when you change the polarization of one of the magnetic domains, then the domain wall moves, and you get a pulse in a coil that you can read. And Wiegand wire is made out of a processed magnetic alloy that's structured so that it has two almost ideal magnetic domains. It has the soft, low coercivity core that's easy to polarize, and has a high coercivity shell that's not easy to polarize since it's high coercivity. And the thing is, and so when you change the polarization of the core from the opposite direction of the shell to the same direction of the shell, then you get a nice big pulse in your sense coil. So how does this work in a weakened wired card? In a weakened wired card, you have two rows of weakened wires. You have one row representing zeros and one row representing ones. As you swipe it through the weakened wire reader, first there's a saturating permanent magnet that initializes it to a known state. And then as it moves over the read heads, two other permanent magnets switch the polarization of the core back and forth to get a nice big spike over the read coil. You can sort of see what it looks like on a card here. You can see on the magnetic film, each of those lines is one of the weakened wires. Now, these were billed for a long time as...
Whoa, someone just stole my IP address.
or
Whoever picked 10.0.0.222, damn you.
Okay.
Back to our regularly scheduled presentation.
Yeah. So these were billed as really high security for quite a while, and they're actually still billed as high security if you go look on the vendors' websites. And the thing about it, at first glance, it makes sense, right? You can't walk down to a hardware store and buy a weakened wire. We can't even special order it online. It's extremely difficult to find these days. But if you'll notice, every weakened wired card has everything you need to make another weakened wired card that's different. So you can sort of cut them up and make a new one. And this attack was found in 1996, or was first published on the Cypherpunks list quite a while ago. But the cards are also vulnerable to emulation-style attacks, which are another problem with magnetic magstripe cards. The basic problem is that inside of these things, right? Inside of these readers, you just have standard magnetic coils. You just have standard read coils, and so if you want to just hook a microprocessor, or microcontroller up to a solenoid or a coil, you can stick that coil in the weakened wire reader, make a few pulses, and emulate a weakened wire card. The point is that you just have to copy the effect of the card rather than fabricating an entirely new card yourself. Moving on from magnetism, you have barcodes. Barcodes are great for libraries and supermarkets. Not much else. You have 1D and 2D with varying amounts of information stored on them. But they're easy, trivial to duplicate, sometimes to modify, unless you've embedded a Mac in a 2D barcode or something like that. For a while, people spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make invisible barcodes that would fluoresce when you put them under UV or infrared light. But that makes it only marginally more difficult to copy. Prox and RFID cards, they have many well-known issues. You can spoof them, you can clone them, you can surreptitiously read them. The problems have been well documented. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that here. However, prox cards are also one of the most commonly deployed systems today, right? And so they offer an interesting opportunity to look at the junction of a new system and a legacy system and some of the things that you can get from there. So about 5 years ago, MIT started deploying prox cards. Prior to that, they had been predominantly magstripe. And when they introduced the prox cards were on a different system, and so they had to have different ID numbers in them. They had a different number that the central computer would validate. But the numbers between the magstripes and the RFIDs were related. It wasn't quite a one-to-one mapping, but it was really quite close. And if given a prox card, you could figure out a magstripe ID number, and vice versa. And this is an interesting problem, because now you can sort of walk up behind somebody, surreptitiously read their prox card, and then fabricate a magstripe card. And if people aren't really, looking for that kind of attack, then it can be surprisingly annoying. Prox cards, though, they're not always that popular. People don't like being tracked all over the place. So, some people, they make their own keys. Richard Stallman, for example, his office key is a little bit special. Rather than pretending that it's him, it buzzes in as one of 5 of his office mates. So the step above prox cards, you have CPU tokens, which is basically just a chip inside something else. Smart cards is a chip inside plastic. iButtons is a chip inside a metal can. They're nice because they can do much more complicated things than prox cards. They can perform actual cryptographic protocols. Because the problem is that, with just a prox card or just a standard, CPU token without any kind of protection, it's very easy to make a virtual token. You just have a microprocessor talking one wire, or whatever your bus protocol is, and you sort of stick the wires to the reader and you're good to go. But these are nice because some of them have various cryptographic things internally. But that's not to say that they're perfect. DirecTV waged a war with hackers that lasted quite a while. The smart cards are vulnerable to all sorts of fun differential power analysis attacks and things to that effect. And they didn't actually win technologically, and eventually only won when they had the law changed in Canada. Now, Eric's going to talk a bit about knowledge-based systems.
There's really three: mechanical combination locks, electronic keypads, and safe-type electronic locks. Mechanical combination lock you've certainly seen before. This is a Simplex Unican 1000. It looks like the white point on the projector is set a little bit low, so you can't actually see any detail in the lock. But the upshot of this system, because it's mechanical, simple to use, it's reliable, doesn't need any power. Unfortunately, it also doesn't have any kind of audit trail. You can manipulate it if you know how. It's a little complicated, but I'll teach you in just a minute. You can also use a brute force attack. Because these locks can only use one number once in the combination, you can't have a 2-1-2 as a valid combination, it just doesn't work. There's a lot smaller combination space than you might think. And a Berkeley class actually used this as an example for their students. If you go online, here's the URL. It's a nice problem in combinatorics for you math nerds. Or if you're lazy and you hate math like I do, you can just go to the second URL, which is a list of all the combinations. It'll take you about 10 minutes to run through, open every lock like this you might ever come across. But I find manipulation an awful lot more interesting because it's a lot more intelligent and a lot more cool. To understand how it works, you've got to understand how the lock works. And how it works is it has this black bar on the bottom with these L-shaped protrusions. When this bar is pushed over to the left, usually be pushed up because locks are usually mounted vertically, but here, when it's pushed over to the left, it engages these rotating tumblers. These rotating tumblers have gates cut in them, and they're rotated by you pushing the buttons. Here you can see that two of them, the last two, are already in the correct position, because those last two numbers aren't actually used in the combination. If I were to press the 4 or the 5 buttons, it would advance those tumblers even further and cause them to block the movement of the bar. However, if I were to enter 2-1-3, which is the current combination in this lock, the first 3 tumblers would be correctly aligned and the lock would be able to open. Now, how does the lock know whether I entered 2-1-3 or 1-2-3? Every time I push a tumbler, the button to depress that tumbler is deactivated, but the tumbler is connected to a linkage so that every subsequent number I press will advance any previously pressed tumblers by 1 position. It's a little hard to understand, but I'll get to this in a little more detail. I'm going to show you a video of this happening. Me entering the combination, which has been changed for purposes of obviousness to 1-2-3, and opening the lock. 1. You can see the first tumbler advances, first tumbler and the second tumbler advance again, the lock opens, and the mechanism resets itself. The linkage I'm operating on the left side with my thumb is what would normally be connected to the handle. There's a sort of clutch mechanism that when you depress the handle a certain distance, it applies pressure to the locking bar. If you depress it any further, it rotates this mechanism in the opposite direction for setting the lock. So to manipulate this lock, we first have to figure out which of these tumblers is binding. You guys all know how to pick locks, right? I hope so. If you don't, you should learn. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to use the same principle as in lock picking to figure out the combination. We're going to use the binding tumblers. One of these tumblers is going to be a bit thicker or a bit out of tolerance compared to the rest. And when we apply force to that locking bar, it's going to cause that one tumbler to not want to budge. And we're going to be able to feel that in the buttons. This is, again, finding which one's binding. The top one is binding. It doesn't want to move. The second, third, fourth, and fifth ones move great. Since the first one is binding, we know from the outside of the lock that that first tumbler is not in the correct position. We don't know what position it's supposed to be in, but we know that it's not supposed to be in the 0th position. So we're going to put it in the first position by pushing the button. And now we're going to check to see if any other tumblers are binding. Because guess what? If we put that first tumbler in the correct position by pushing it once, then a new tumbler would start binding and we would be able to feel that. Unfortunately, a new tumbler isn't binding. So we know that the first tumbler isn't in the 0th position and isn't in the first position. So we're going to advance it by 1 position by pressing a throwaway button. This can be any other button that isn't the first button. It's some button we don't know anything about. In this case, I used 5. I'm going to show you the video again just for the heck of it. I press 5, which advances the first tumbler by 1, and now check for binding in the other tumblers, which we don't see. So we try another throwaway button. In this case, I'm going to use the 4th button. And now we discover that the second tumbler has started binding, because the first tumbler is now in the correct position. We reset the lock, and we try, okay, we know that the first tumbler is in the correct position. We know that the second tumbler is not in the correct position. So we're going to try moving the second tumbler by 1 and the first tumbler by 2. We're going to try a trial combination, 1, 5, 2. This puts the first tumbler in the second position, the 5th tumbler in the first position, and the second tumbler in the first position. And we check to see if any are binding. Nope. So we try it. Okay, if the second tumbler was in the wrong position, let's put the second tumbler in the second position. We try 1, 2, 5. This puts the first and second tumblers in the correct position, as it so happens. We can tell because we're cheating looking at the actual locking components right here. And we see if another tumbler is binding. As it happens, because the first and second tumblers are in the correct position, now the third tumbler is binding. So we try the combination 1, 2, 3 to put the first tumbler in the second position, the second tumbler in the first position, and the third tumbler in the 0th or first position, and the lock opens. Bada bing. Takes you about a minute or 2 once you get good at it. You can do this on any lock in the field. It's a little more complicated if this lock has been set up so that you have to push 2 numbers at the same time. But it's still doable. If you want to learn how to do it, there's a great document that was written a long time ago by a guy called The Hobbit. If you look online, it's all over the web. It's almost incomprehensible if you don't know how the lock works. Fortunately, now you do. So if you Google for Simplex Hobbit, you'll probably find it right now. And I'm going to move on to the electronic version of a knowledge-based lock. Traditionally, these have been defeated using UV theft detection powder. Again, because the white point is set a bit low, you can't actually see the powder because it's white. How this works is you dust the powder, you dust the keypad with UV powder. You come back the next day after the lock has been opened, and you shine your handy-dandy UV flashlight on the lock, and you see which keys have had the powder rubbed off. And then you come back and try again and again and again each permutation of those keys until the lock opens. This is kind of problematic because you're going to be sitting there for a week or 2. And if the lock locks you out after 3 or 10 incorrect tries, you're probably up shit creek because it might take a year. So what you can do is use a highlighter. As it turns out, highlighters will be tracked from key to key for just about 1 step. This was discovered by a couple friends of mine who shall remain anonymous at MIT. You can also use shoulder surfing and hidden cameras. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about the highlighter trick in just a sec. Shoulder surfing, hidden cameras. Johnny Long showed us a great video of this last night, if you were there for the talk. It's absolutely hilarious. Just watch the keypad with a hidden camera. Anyway, about this UV powder trick, the fluorescent powder trick, I mean. If you look at this keypad, this is a perfectly ordinary keypad. In fact, this is the keypad from a sensor I'm going to be showing you a bit later on in this talk. If you look at the number 1 key, it looks a little bit different. To the left of the number 1, you can just see the faintest trace of a highlighter. If someone doing this in the field were a little worried, but maybe someone would look at the keypad and say, hey, someone put highlighter on my keypad, they must be trying to break into my system. Well, you graffiti all over the lock, and oh, some kids got to it. Under UV light, it looks a little bit different. You can see very clearly this UV marking. So I put the highlighter on the key, I go away, and I wait for someone to enter the combination. I come back again later that day, maybe the next day, with my UV flashlight and discover that that highlighter has been tracked from the number 1 to the number 2 key. Okay. I wipe off the keypad, put the highlighter on again, this time on the number 2 key, and come back again. This time we can see it's been tracked from the 2 key to the 3 key and a little bit to the 4 key. Okay, clean off the keys, put some on the number 3 key. Come back again, it's been tracked to the 4 key. Clean it all off, come back again, put some on the 4 key, and it hasn't been tracked anywhere. It's just been smudged. This means that this is probably the last key in the combination. But we don't, in fact, know that the combination is 1, 2, 3, 4, because somebody could have pressed 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and nothing would have been tracked to the 5 key, obviously. So we try 5, and we try 6, and we try 7, 8, and 9, and 0, and nothing happens, not even smudged. We now know that the combination is 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't have to try every permutation of the combination. We can just break this as is, wipe this off with isopropyl alcohol, and there'll be no trace left for anybody to find. Of course, if you're really feeling lazy, this is a hidden camera. This thing's about the size of a quarter. It has a built-in radio transmitter to transmit to your stock or van or whatever it is you're using. Powered from a 9-volt battery. You can hide it pretty much anywhere and watch as they enter the combination. So what's the solution to all this if you're the guy who's in charge of making that keypad secure? Well, yes. Say it louder.
Scramble keypads, where every time you show up, it mixes the order of numbers up.
Yes. These are keypads that have LED displays behind each key. Every time you enter the combination, the order of the keys changes. It's kind of like Hogwarts. What they do is, in addition to putting these LED displays behind each key and changing the combination, they recess those lights, those LED lights, very deep into the keypad, so that they're only visible from a very narrow family of angles, and they're pretty dim anyway. So if you're standing behind the guy, you can't see jack. Of course, he can still turn around and tell you what number he just entered, which is the fundamental problem, and isn't even solved by very, very high security safe-type electronic locks. This is a Moss-Hamilton, or actually Kaba-Moss X08. These were at one point used to protect every classified document, or just about every classified document in this entire country. Now they use just about the same lock, slightly different model called the X09, but still suffers from the same problem that anyone can give out the combination. However, beyond that, they're pretty much as secure as it gets. They also have an audit trail, being electronic. The X08, X09, and the predecessor, the X07, will tell you how many times the lock has been opened and how many times someone has tried to enter the wrong combination. This isn't a terribly sophisticated audit trail as things go. And especially in the ATM field, where you need high security and you need to know whether it was the guy that fixes the ATM machine, the guy that loads the ATM machine, the guy that owns the ATM machine, or a fourth burglar that stole the money out of the ATM machine, you need more of an audit trail. So a company called Legarde came up with the Navigator. This is a web-based safe lock. The idea is that you have the guy who's supposed to open the lock come up with his smartphone. He connects it to the lock, and the smartphone has some software on it which lets him type in his password, and it connects to the central server, authenticates, and then opens the lock. If the owner leaves the smartphone connected to the safe, powered up, the owner can open the safe remotely. Now, as it turns out, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has ever actually done any research on the Legarde Navigator, so we don't actually know whether it has any holes. I'll bet it does. And last but not least is the old safe technician's trick of spiking. Basically, you drill a hole or two into the safe, and you stick some probes into that hole. And if you drilled the hole just right, those probes will just hit the solenoid wires that operate the bolt. You apply 9 volt or 12 volt to those wires, and pop, the safe is open. And those holes are probably small enough that you can cover them with epoxy or a little bit of putty, and nobody will ever notice they're there. Next up, now that I've gotten through pretty much all the knowledge-based locks, I'm going to talk about biometrics. This is the stuff of movies. Voice print, face print, fingerprint recognition, hand geometry, retina scan, iris scan, and last but not least, signature recognition. Voice pattern recognition. Basically, you go up, you say, my voice is my password or whatever, and it authenticates after doing an FFT or somehow creating a voice pattern. Unfortunately, as time goes on, your voice gets different.
If you're a teenager, you probably saw this happen. If you were a teenager once, you probably saw this happen very quickly. As you get really old, it really changes. If you get really stressed, if you're dealing with 30,000 things and you're under a tight deadline, your voice is going to sound very different and very tense, very much more tense than if you're getting a massage. If you get sick, if your sinuses are stuffed up, again, this might cause a very high false reject rate. But more importantly, from our perspective, any doofus can hide a tape recorder next to the voice print microphone and play it back when he wants to get in the building. He can also record you from a distance with a shotgun microphone or parabolic microphone, edit everything together on his computer, and get into the building. That's why these systems aren't used very widely. One system that is used a bit more widely is face recognition. And this thing just screwed up. Cool. Now, the traditional attack for face recognition was to hold up a photograph. You go up to the guy on the street, you take his picture, he's like stupid tourists. He doesn't know that you're not a tourist, you're the guy who's going to come to the door after hours, hold up his picture, or go over to his workstation, hold up the picture to his webcam, and log into his workstation under his credentials. This is why facial recognition manufacturers introduced live checks, basically looking for subtle movements of the head, little facial expressions, things that the face is always doing, but that a photograph can't replicate for obvious reasons. Some security researchers figured out that all you have to do was videotape the guy on the street, stupid tourists again, and hold up the video on your laptop screen. Of course, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, but wait, I read Slashdot this morning, and there's a company talking about doing this with ATMs, and they're using 3D facial recognition, right? The thing is, this company, actually these researchers that are talking about doing this, are using a 3D digitizer, the idea being that it scans your face with laser beam, I believe, to create a three-dimensional representation of your face. It's very accurate. These have been used by model makers, people who do like Pixar movies for years and years and years, but they aren't designed to be resistant to bypass. And so I don't see any reason why someone couldn't block the laser beam and hold up a video of a laser beam scanning the guy's face, which you rendered in your favorite 3D modeling software. Next up is fingerprints. I'm sure you guys have all heard of some vulnerabilities. The old breathe on it, put a condom on it, put a gummy bear on it, because after all, when you put your finger on a fingerprint sensor, you leave behind a fingerprint. And all you need to do is put something on it to get the fingerprint sensor to think there's a fingerprint on there, and it will read the fingerprint. Of course, swipe-type fingerprint readers were introduced. If those of you who have IBM ThinkPads and think you're super secure might want to pay attention to this one. The swipe-type fingerprint readers took the brilliant idea of, instead of having you put your fingerprint on the sensor, have you put your fingerprint swiped across the sensor. The upshot of this is that there's no fingerprint left on the sensor. Unfortunately, there's also fingerprints left on the laptop, on the door handle, on everything else. Which means that you can dust it for fingerprints, photograph that dusted fingerprint, bring it into Photoshop, do a little bit of tweaking, send it off to your favorite printed circuit board manufacturer, of which there are dozens who will happily do this for you. Get it back, put some Elmer's glue or Second Skin, which is an anti-burn product, which is really great for this stuff. Put some of the stuff on that printed circuit board, super glue it to your finger, go up to that swipe fingerprint sensor and swipe that fake fingerprint across the sensor, which you took from the latent fingerprint on the door handle or whatever, and get into the lock, get into the laptop. The solution here, of course, is trained guards, right? People watching for gummy bear wielding attackers. Well, if you use some Elmer's glue or whatever, super glue to your finger, it's not going to look like you're an attacker. It's going to look like you forgot to use skin moisturizing lotion that morning. And nobody's going to spot it. A company came up with something called multispectral imaging as a solution to this problem. They claim that their brand new shiny technology doesn't require any contact between the finger and reader, which means if you're a construction worker and your fingers are covered in dirt, this is really great. It can read underwater, which means if you're in the soaking rain and your hands are massively wet from shielding your laptop or whatever, you can still get into the building. And it will inherently differentiate between a live finger and any kind of fake finger. The idea is that different wavelengths of infrared light, will penetrate different distances into the skin. This is something that's been known for a long time and works really well. What they're doing is they take a multispectral infrared light source and use it to photograph the fingerprint with a sensor that is designed to pick up on a whole bunch of broad range of infrared wavelengths. What happens if you're using a fake finger, according to these guys, is that it will pick up not only on the fake fingerprint that you want the sensor to see, but the real fingerprint on your finger underneath. And it'll see this cross-hatched pattern. If you can somehow get around this by, say, using a solid cast finger, you can, then the sensor will still see the blood flow under the finger. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody press their face up to the glass and make some really grotesque stuff to gross out their little sister. But what happens is when you press your finger or any other flesh soft bit up to a hard surface, the blood moves away. It's called blanching. And according to these guys, multispectral imaging will pick up on that blood flow, which doesn't exist in any kind of prosthetic or fake finger, and will make for a very, very different looking data set, which will cause a rejection. Unfortunately, this technology is new enough that nobody's done any research yet. Next one I'm going to talk about is hand geometry. This is kind of cool, because one of the big issues with biometrics is privacy. If you're enrolling your fingerprint into a database, then anybody can crack that database and steal your fingerprint and use that to get in everywhere else. There's been rather a lot of research done, in fact, on reverse biometrics, where somebody takes the database information and creates a fingerprint. But with handprints, they're not unique. I probably have the same hand shape and size as at least somebody else in this room. The rate is about 1 in 100, 1 in 200 or so. This makes for great things when when somebody says, ooh, biometrics, isn't that a big privacy hole? And you can say, but wait. Unfortunately, because hands aren't that unique, it's possible to, say, find a guy with a similar hand and get him to open the door, or make a dummy hand, which is more or less about what the hand shape and size is. This is the view of the camera inside a handprint sensor. Just for the heck of it, we took this picture, printed it out on a laser printer, after doing some contrast enhancements in Photoshop, cut out the paper hand and stuck it in our handprint reader. Of course, it didn't work right, because at the top right you see a little wedge. That wedge is a mirror, which reflects across the top of the fingers and shows finger thickness to the sensor. Unfortunately, if, say, the boss has said, darn it, this thing keeps rejecting my hand, do whatever it takes to make it accept me in the morning, and you increase the threshold from the default of 100 to maybe 150, maybe 200, that flat paper hand will work. Anybody can go up to the handprint sensor, enter the code, the verification, the user ID, which you don't tell the user to keep secret because it's no big deal. They can enter the code, put a fake paper hand in the sensor, and get in. The next one we're going to talk about is retina scan. This is pretty secure. Nobody in the public literature has falsified a retina because it's pretty complicated. You have a whole bunch of different optical indices, liquids going on, stuff that to duplicate is a royal pain. Unfortunately, for a retina scanner to work, it has to be pretty invasive. This means that for me to get my retina scanned, I have to go up to the scanner, take off my glasses, and put my eye right up to this scanner and hold it there while this really bright light blinds me for about 30 seconds in order to take a picture of my retina. This is fine if you're the US government protecting nuclear secrets and you have people willing to go through this. But most people in most applications really don't like to do it. And so companies came up with iris scan. This is really great because it isn't nearly as invasive. Irises can be read from a couple inches to a couple feet away with a simple camera. And because irises are so unique, it has a really low error rate. About 1 in a million equal error rate. This means that if you're willing to take a false reject rate of 1 in 10,000, you'll get a false accept rate of 1 in a trillion. Super great, right? Except for one thing. You know that boss of yours, that really egotistical boss that demanded to be given, just for the sake of his ego, access to the entire facility? Well, chances are he's going to be on the cover of some random business magazine sooner or later. And your average business magazine cover portrait has enough resolution to hold it up to the iris scanner and get in. Moreover, if you have an armed guard standing there, checking to make sure there aren't any magazine cover wielding attackers coming up to the sensor, that attacker can print that information onto a contact lens using any number of several custom contact lens services, walk up to the sensor and get in. It's kind of a problem, and nobody's really solved it yet. And last but not least, we're getting into the talk a bit. Signature is kind of the closing thing of any document in the closing part of this talk. Signature recognition. Financial institutions really, really love this idea. Because what does everybody already do to close any kind of business deal? Now we can verify this finally and technologically, right? Well, first of all, you've got a couple of problems. When people sign their name, it's never quite the same. The image is never quite the same in every signature you make. So you have to use a pressure-sensitive tablet, which measures the pressure on the pen and the velocity of the person signing and the velocity of the pen as people sign their name. Even once you have this, you still get about a 1% equal error rate. This means that the financial institution standard of 0.001% insult rate, because they really don't like pissing off their customers, and 1% false accept rate, because a little fraud is okay, a lot of fraud is not, isn't workable with this system. Most importantly, though, who here learned to forge their parents' signature in elementary school to go on field trips? Yeah, I know, I did. You go into class, and it's like, damn, I forgot to get that form signed. But I really want to go to the museum of whatever it is. Okay, quick, scribble something down and hope she doesn't notice. And I got pretty good at it. I don't know, I guess some of you guys did probably too. If, as elementary school kids, we could learn to forge our parents' signatures, what do you think about that dedicated attacker who really wants to get into your installation? It's not a very secure system. And that brings us to the end of our talk. We're going to talk about some further reading. If you like physical security, as a member of the board of directors of Tool USA, I'm obligated to tell you to come to the Lockpick Village at DEF CON. But if you want some further reading, Ross Anderson Security Engineering is the book from which a lot of this talk was shamelessly stolen. It's a really great text on the general aspects of security, some great stories, great statistics. Mike has another favorite.
Sure. The Handbook of Multi-Biometrics is fantastic if you're looking for a good overview of how to combine information from different biometric systems, and a good overview on biometrics in general. Strongly recommended.
Any questions? Yeah.
What's your opinion of electronic keys and hybrid mechanical?
So the question is, what's our opinion of hybrid electromechanical systems where you would say have a regular key that happens to have a transponder in the bow of the key which communicates with the lock? And these can be great, though you still have the problem that they need power, and you get manufacturers who are really stupid. Like there's one manufacturer in Europe who did this great looking system on paper. He used 128-bit encryption, everything else, called the Winkhouse Blue Chip. Unfortunately, they put the solenoid in their lock cylinder in just the wrong place. And any doofus with a really big neodymium magnet could go up to the lock and slap the magnet on the lock and open the door. Yes? Sorry, can you say that louder? Yeah, the printing on the contact lens is a service that people do a lot. The thing that people are still trying to overcome in making this, a real live attack, and this is something that government agencies probably have overcome and simply told nobody about, is that the current resolution of most of the cheap ones, most of the cheap printers, isn't quite enough. And so it's theoretical if you're trying to do this as your Joe average burglar. If you're trying to protect against a serious attacker, I wouldn't bet on it. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? Sold. Have a good day.